Today, we're going to learn about reform movements in the United States and in Washington state in the early 20th century, which would be from about 1900 through the 1920s. Okay. You'll watch this video, and then there's a reading assignment, and then you will do a 12 question form quiz to complete the assignment. Let's take a little look at some slides I prepared. This is a little more interesting than going through the text because you'll go through that later. Let's take a look at these and talk about the Reform era and the Gilded Age. Okay, the Gilded Age was a period in the early 20th century. Gilded means covered in gold. Many Americans became very wealthy. As a matter of fact, 5% of Americans controlled most of the wealth in the country at that time. Actually, kind of similar to today. It was a period of transformation in Washington state and the United States, as there was a lot of growth, but the era was not gilded for all. The Gilded Age was a period of inequality in wealth and opportunity. There was an upper class, and as I just said, they had most of the wealth. There was also a lower class that did all the work. And before the unions and things that we talked about yesterday, there really wasn't any middle class because people didn't get paid much for doing work for others. There was a lot of corruption in business and politics. There were poor work conditions and there was poverty. So you had people like the picture on the left that had a lot of wealth and a lot of food and dressed nice and could have a good time. And then you had a lot of people that were really having a rough time, maybe jobless or barely getting by. Big business is ruled through monopoly. Monopoly occurs when one company controls an entire segment of business. So it would be like if only one company made all the cars, you wouldn't have much choice. It also meant that they didn't have to pay people as much money. There was a need for change, and it spawned reform, labor unions, and law changes. Here's a vocabulary. What is reform? I just said it. What is it? There's a good little picture. Look at a couple little boys. They're working in a factory, and then there's some happy kids at school. A reform would change that situation where people went from a bad situation to a good situation. So reform means to bring about positive change. A reformer is a person who seeks to address social, economic, and or political problems by bringing about positive change. Corruption. Yeah, a lot of that going on back then too. Corruption occurred with big business and government often working together. Example, the railroads in the late 19th century. They were privately owned, but they got a lot of money from the government to build them. And at times, either wanted favor from the other to gain power, meaning that the government would want a company that they gave a lot of money to vote for their interests so they could have power. And the company would try and elect a lot of people that would favor them so they could continue to keep their power. So it was corrupt. It became very corrupt. Large companies wanted government to reduce competition and allow monopolies. Politicians wanted business people to work in groups to support them after they provided favors through political machines. Politicians rewarded business people through the spoils system. Corruption between big business and government created inequality in worker pay and opportunity. What is a monopoly, you might ask, after we just brought up that word? A monopoly occurs when one company controls an entire industry. Monopolies reduce choice for consumers. This can cause costs to rise significantly on items that are important in maintaining life quality. For instance, if one company made all the cars in the United States, they could charge one set price. They also wouldn't have to pay workers a lot because there's no competition, no other company building better cars, maybe paying people more money to build better cars. What's a political machine? Political machine is a group of powerful people working to promote the political interests of an individual or an idea. When government is controlled by a political machine, the public interest is not usually served. Politicians in this system usually serve those who provide them money or got them elected, not all of the people. They just favor those who favor them. And then finally, what is a spoils system? A spoils system occurs when government officials provide jobs to loyal supporters. When people gain jobs through the spoils system, they usually just tell those in power what they want to hear, reinforcing whatever beliefs they have. So they're not open to change, public will, or often what is best for all. Okay, so let's go back a couple of slides now to where those words were included initially when we were talking about corruption. Now that you know what the words mean. Large companies during the Gilded Age wanted government to reduce competition and have monopolies, meaning they wanted to run everything. Politicians wanted business people to work in groups to support them after they provided favors through political machines. Politicians rewarded business people through the spoils system, meaning people who supported them, they got all the support and all the money from the politicians. So again, it was very corrupt. What about the progressive movement? What did it do? The progressive movement was a collection of many different reforms. Progressives wanted to end corruption. They wanted to address economic problems and improve society. Basically, they wanted to get rid of all the bad things we just talked about that were occurring during the Gilded Age. Prohibition was one thing they did. Prohibition, progressives felt alcohol use was responsible for violence against women and children. Basically, they thought people get all boozed up and beat up their wives and their girlfriends and their kids. And so they thought alcohol caused that and that it was bad. Progressive politicians pushed through a thing called prohibition, and it banned alcohol across the United States. You couldn't sell it, you couldn't make it, you couldn't buy it. Could you find it? Yeah. And access to alcohol remained relatively easy in Washington state, as there were these people called rum runners that brought it down illegally from Canada. So it was easy to get it across the border. But it wasn't as easy as if you just go in a store and buy it. So it did limit the consumption quite a bit. What about political reforms? Progressives wanted government to be more responsible. They created a municipal league in Seattle to end the spoils system. Progressives used initiatives, referendums, and recalls to put government power back in the hands of the people. They reformed government through some of the action of individuals as well. This is a picture of Governor John Rogers. He was a progressive leader, and he fired unqualified workers who had been appointed through the spoils system. Basically, the government prior to John Rogers in the first few years of the state had been run by a bunch of people appointed by governors who really weren't qualified to do anything, but they were friends of the governor who put him in power. John Rogers got rid of those people and cleaned things up. There was another leader, Hiram Gill. He was a mayor of Seattle, and he was corrupt. He was recalled, meaning they put out a recall election before his election was over. Before his term was over, they had a special election and got rid of him because he was so corrupt. The people did that. What about business reform? Utility companies, railroads, and other businesses had become the monopolies that we talked about earlier. They charged high rates and they provided poor service. They were generally privately owned, even though they'd gotten government money, but they needed reform. Progressives worked to break up these business monopolies. Reformers passed laws that made public ownership possible of utilities and railroads. So the railroads and the utilities went from being owned privately, where they could jack up the rates, charge whatever they wanted, create unfair situations, to where the government owned them and they charged lower rates and provided better services during this period. And then finally, women's rights. Until 1910, no women in the United States had the right to vote. You may remember we talked about earlier. During the formation of the first state constitution, people wanted to include the right to vote for women in the Washington Constitution, but it was taken out. Washington did provide that right 10 years before the rest of the United States. In 1910, the state of Washington passed a state constitutional amendment that allowed women to vote on state and local issues, allowed them to serve on juries, and allowed them to work in government positions. And then finally, women gained the right to vote throughout the United States when the United States Constitution was amended. But women in Washington got the right 10 years before other women in the United States. So what were the progressives? Who were the progressives? Progressives wanted to end corruption, address economic problems, and improve society. What did Prohibition do? Prohibition banned the sale and consumption of alcohol across the United States. Okay, so that's it for today. That is the lesson. Here's what you need to do now. You need to go back into the assignment, open up the reading that covers what we just covered in slides, but in quite a bit more detail. I believe there are 8 pages there. A lot of these same terms are reviewed and explained in more detail, as well as events that happened during that time. See, it's all loaded right there. And then once you are done, go in and complete the 12-question quiz. All right. If you have questions, let me know. Good luck. Thanks.